The Galactic Horror Archive credits humanity with inventing suspense as a terror technique. Part 1. Archivists had served the Galactic Horror Archive for 400 years, and in all that time, nothing had ever surprised them. This was not a boast. It was simply the nature of being part of the collective mind. Experienced reality through quantum probability matrices, which meant they perceived every possible outcome of every situation simultaneously. Surprise required the unexpected, and when one experienced all potential futures at once, nothing remained unexpected. The archive itself was a monument to fear, stretching across 12 cubic of carefully shielded space. Within its crystalline databases resided over 40,000 species attempts to fright, horrify, and disturb. The Ox had contributed biological nightmares that rewrote DNA on sight. The Thought Eaters had submitted telepathic assaults that induced permanent madness. The Screaming Dark had provided recordings of sounds that made sentient beings beg for deafness. Had them all without flinching. Their quantum consciousness allowed them to experience the horror, categorize it, and file it away across multiple probability streams. Fear, they had learned, came in recognizable patterns. Immediate shock relied on sudden sensory assault. Visceral disgust exploited biological imperatives. Existential dread attacked the foundation of consciousness itself. Psychological torture broke down identity over time. Every species in the galaxy had contributed something to one of these categories. Some submissions were crude, others sophisticated, but all fit within the established framework. The archive had not needed to create a new classification in over 8,000 years. Then humanity applied for archive access. The application landed in its processing queue on a day like any other. Humanity, it noted, was a relatively young species, barely 3,000 years into their recorded civilization. They were physically unremarkable, technologically adequate, and had only achieved faster-than-light travel 200 years prior. Their application requested permission to submit examples of what they called fear entertainment to the archive's permanent collection. Process the request through standard channels. Every species believed their approach to horror was unique. Most were wrong. Still, the archive welcomed all legitimate submissions. The collective mind approved humanity's application and assigned as the reviewing archivist. The first submission arrived 3 weeks later, delivered via standard data crystal. The format was audiovisual, which was common enough. The title translated as Jaws. Loaded it into their review chamber, a space specifically designed to safely experience potentially hazardous sensory input, and began playback. The human entertainment began simply enough. A young human female entered water during a dark period. The setting: nighttime ocean, isolated location, vulnerable individual. They prepared their analysis matrices for either visceral attack or sudden shock. The probability stream suggested 73% chance of immediate violence, 22% chance of building psychological dread, 5% other outcomes. The attack came quickly. Something beneath the water struck the female. She screamed. Violence followed. Then the sequence ended and the scene changed completely. Paused their analysis. According to their probability calculations, the violent sequence should have continued or escalated. Instead, the humans were now showing a different location entirely, with different individuals, engaged in mundane conversation. Recalculated. Perhaps this was an anthology format, where multiple unrelated fear scenarios would be presented sequentially. But no, the next scenes involved humans discussing the previous attack. A hunter was hired to find the creature responsible. More mundane conversations followed. Humans walked on beaches. Humans argued about economic concerns. Humans performed bureaucratic functions. Processing clusters hummed with confusion. 17 minutes of playback had elapsed, and nothing frightening had occurred since the opening sequence. By conventional horror metrics, this was catastrophically inefficient. The Ox could induce complete psychological breakdown in 8 seconds. The Thought Eaters required only a single moment of contact. Yet here was humanity, spending precious runtime showing municipal politics and human social dynamics. Then notice something odd happening in their auxiliary neural clusters, a sensation they didn't immediately recognize. They were experiencing anticipation, not the calm observation of multiple probable futures, but something focused and uncomfortable. They found themselves wanting the creature to appear, wanting something, anything, to break the tension that had somehow built during scenes of humans simply talking. Another attack came, brief, shocking, a child on an inflatable device. Its matrices collapsed momentarily into a single timeline, experiencing what humans would call surprise. Then the scene ended again, returning to more human conversation. Recalibrated their processing. Something was wrong with their analysis, or something was profoundly different about this submission. They continued playback, now paying attention not just to the content but to their own reactions. The humans introduced musical patterns, simple notes that preceded danger. Consciousness began responding to these patterns, their neural clusters firing in anticipation whenever the music began. They were being trained, they realized, to fear a sound, not because the sound itself was harmful, but because it predicted something harmful might follow. More time passed, more mundane human activity, men on a boat, conversations about family and purpose. Then the music would begin and its entire consciousness would focus, waiting, dreading what might emerge from the water. Sometimes the creature appeared, often it did not. The uncertainty became its own form of torture. Barrels appeared in the water. The humans explained these would mark the creature's location. Found themselves staring at the barrels, watching for movement, their quantum probability matrices reduced to a single desperate question. When would the creature surface? Not if. When. The humans had made complicit in their own distress by making them want to see the very thing they dreaded. 81 minutes into the playback, the creature finally appeared in full view, experienced something they had not felt in centuries, the passage of time as burden. They had waited, suffered through the waiting, and when the revelation came, it was almost a relief, even though the creature was objectively terrifying. When the entertainment concluded, sat motionless in their review chamber for 3 full minutes, an eternity for a consciousness that operated across multiple probability streams. They replayed their own reactions, studying the data. Throughout the playback, their neural activity had shown patterns never before recorded in their species. They had experienced what humans called suspense. Immediately flagged the submission as requiring deeper analysis. They accessed humanity's cultural database, searching for context. What they discovered made their processing clusters burn with the heat of accelerated computation. Suspense, they learned, was not an accident. It was intentional. Humans had developed an entire theory around the deliberate withholding of information, the strategic use of anticipation, the of imagination itself. They had terms for it: dramatic tension, narrative packing, Hitchcockian technique. They had refined it over thousands of years of storytelling. More disturbing, they used it everywhere. Not just in entertainment, but in their negotiations, their military tactics, their social interactions. Humanity had spent its entire evolutionary history as what they called persistence predators, tracking prey over vast distances, imagining what might be ahead, planning for unseen dangers. They had evolved to torture themselves with possible futures, and they had turned that torture into art. Accessed more human submissions. Hundreds of them were now arriving, as if humanity had been waiting for someone to finally ask. Films, books, audio dramas, all employing the same technique with variations. Some used visual anticipation, showing corridors that might contain threats. Others used sound or the absence of sound. Some used time itself, counting down to disasters that might or might not occur. Each one affected the same way. Their quantum consciousness, which should have been immune to surprise, found itself trapped in the psychological present moment. The multiplicity of possible futures collapsed into a singular, agonizing question: What happens next? For the first time in the archive's history, needed to create a new classification. They began drafting the entry, their processing clusters still trembling from the experience. Category name, Suspense. Primary characteristic, weaponized anticipation. Mechanism, exploitation of imagination to create fear of unknown futures. Originating species, humanity. Effectiveness rating, paused at this field. How did one rate a technique that could affect even species that experience time nonlinearly? That could reduce a quantum consciousness to a single, suffering timeline. They entered the rating as unprecedented and flagged it for Galactic Council review. Other species needed to know about this. They needed to be warned. Because if suspense could affect the collective mind, it could affect anyone. Part 2. The report submitted to the Galactic Council ran to 3,000 pages, but the essential message was simple. Humanity had created something genuinely new. Within days, the report had circulated to every major civilization in the galaxy. Within weeks, those civilizations began requesting access to humanity's submissions. The archive's protocols were clear. Once a technique was and deemed non-hazardous, any species could request it for study. The Council reviewed its report and determined that while suspense was psychologically uncomfortable, it did not constitute a mimetic hazard or cognitive weapon. Access was granted. Watched the request queue with growing unease. The hive mind requested 70 human films. The temporal observers, who experienced past and future simultaneously, requested every human mystery novel. The phase-shifted Hall, who existed partially outside normal spacetime, requested humanity's entire of serialized entertainment. The archivist tried to include warnings with each release. They explained that human suspense was specifically designed to exploit prediction-based consciousness. They noted that species with shared mental networks might experience unexpected fragmentation. They emphasized that the technique worked by creating artificial information gaps that consciousness would attempt to fill. Nobody listened to the warnings. Everyone wanted to experience what had affected even the collective mind. The first incident report came from the 3 weeks later. The hive mind consisted of 17 billion individual organisms connected through quantum-entangled neural tissue. They shared all sensory information instantaneously, existing as a single distributed consciousness. They had requested human suspense entertainment out of curiosity, assuming their unified mind would be immune to techniques designed for isolated individuals. They were wrong. The report described what happened when the hive mind experienced a human film called Alien. The story involved a creature hunting humans through a confined space, appearing only in glimpses and shadows. The hive mind's unified consciousness began fracturing. Different nodes started imagining different locations for the creature. Some nodes focused on sounds, others on movement patterns, still others on the implications of biological reproduction methods. For the first time in their species' history, they were not of one mind. Each node experienced suspense differently, creating 17 billion individual anticipations that pulled against their quantum unity. The sensation was so disturbing that they had to sever their connection and exist as individuals for 3 days while they recovered. The phase-shifted Hall reported similar problems. Their species existed in multiple simultaneously, observing events before, during, and after they occurred. Linear narrative should have been meaningless to them, but human suspense created psychological pressure that forced them into a single timeline, experiencing the story moment by moment like a regular species. They described it as being trapped in the present and found the sensation deeply claustrophobic. The temporal observers had perhaps the worst reaction. They requested human mystery novels, stories where information was deliberately until a final revelation. The observer's consciousness naturally skipped to endings, reading conclusions before beginnings. But human mysteries were structured to make this unsatisfying. They included false clues, red herrings, and misdirection. The observers found themselves locked in temporal loops, reading the ending, feeling unsatisfied, returning to the beginning, experiencing suspense despite knowing the outcome, then reading the ending again, still unsatisfied. 3 temporal observers required therapeutic intervention to break free from a single novel called, and then there were none. They had experienced the ending 2,000 times and still felt compelled to return to the beginning, trapped by the narrative structure. Compiled these reports with growing concern. They added new warnings to the archive's access protocols. They suggested that species undergo psychological preparation before experiencing human suspense. They recommended limiting exposure time and requiring cool-down periods between experiences. The requests kept coming. More concerning, the effects were spreading beyond controlled archive access. Species that had experienced human suspense began exhibiting changed behaviors. The serene communes, whose entire philosophy was built on living in the present moment, reported that their meditation techniques were failing. Their monks found themselves troubled by intrusive thoughts about future possibilities. What if the meditation chamber door opened? What if the next breath didn't come? What if, what if, what if? They called it anxiety, a concept they borrowed from human psychology databases. It was suspense without a story, anticipation without a defined threat, fear of possibilities rather than actualities. Before human contact, such a mental state had been unknown to their species. Now it was becoming epidemic. The crystalline philosophers, beings of pure logic who made decisions based solely on probability calculations, began experiencing what they termed calculation paralysis. When faced with decisions, they found themselves imagining worst-case scenarios with disproportionate weight. A 2% chance of negative outcome suddenly felt as significant as a 98% chance of success. They traced this cognitive distortion to exposure to human suspense narratives, which had taught them to fear unlikely possibilities. Even the empathic readers, who could sense the emotional states of any being they encountered, reported problems. After experiencing human horror entertainment, they began sensing emotional echoes that didn't exist. Walking through empty corridors, they felt phantom presences. Entering dark spaces, they anticipated danger. They had absorbed humanity's fear of the unknown so thoroughly that it affected their sensory perception. Documented everything, building a case file that grew daily. 6 months after humanity's first submission, over 200 species had reported psychological changes attributable to human suspense. Most described the development of anticipatory anxiety, the tendency to imagine negative futures, and difficulty maintaining present-moment awareness. The Council received dozens of complaints. The serene communes demanded that human suspense be classified as a mimetic hazard. The phase-shifted hall wanted it restricted to licensed researchers only. A coalition of 17 species filed a formal petition requesting that humanity's archive access be revoked. Was called to testify before the Cultural Hazards Committee. They presented their findings in a sealed chamber, speaking to representatives from 30 major civilizations. They showed the data, the psychological impact assessments, the reports of species-wide behavioral changes. The evidence was overwhelming. Humanity has introduced a cognitive virus, the Serene Commune representative declared. This suspense rewrites how species process time and possibility. It is a weapon disguised as entertainment. It meets the definition of mimetic hazard, added the Hall observer. It spreads through exposure and alters fundamental thought patterns. Our youth are experiencing worry, a concept that didn't exist in our language before human contact. The committee turned to, as the reviewing archivist, what is your assessment? Should humanity's submissions be classified as cognitive weapons? Processing clusters flickered with uncertainty, another uncomfortable sensation they had learned from human suspense. They had documented the harm, yes, but they had also continued studying humanity's technique, trying to understand its full implications. Before I answer, said, I must note something the reports do not capture. Suspense is uncomfortable, yes. It causes anxiety and anticipation, but it also drives behavior in interesting ways. The who experienced fragmentation report that they made better individual decisions during the crisis. The temporal observers, despite their distress, are now able to experience sequential narrative, opening entire new forms of art to them. The serene commune's monks are troubled by future thinking, but several have used this to prevent accidents by anticipating danger. Are you defending this technique? The serene representative asked. I am nodding that it is more complex than simple harm, replied. Humanity did not create suspense to hurt others. They created it to prepare for danger. They evolved on a hostile world where imagining threats before they arrived meant the difference between survival and extinction. This is not a weapon. It is a survival tool that happens to be uncomfortable. The committee was unconvinced. They scheduled a formal tribunal to determine whether human suspense violated the collective creativity accords. If found in violation, humanity would be barred from the archive and possibly face sanctions. Sent the notification to Earth, explaining that humanity would need to defend their technique before the Galactic Council. The response came from the Human Cultural Exchange Bureau, a simple message: we'll send our best. 3 weeks later, Dr. Sarah arrived at the archive, and its probability matrices immediately flagged her as dangerous. Not physically. Doctor was an average-sized human female, unarmed, accompanied only by a small data pad. But there was something in her eyes, a calculation that recognized from studying human suspense masters. She looked at the galaxy's most powerful species and smiled like someone who already knew how the story would end. Thank you for the invitation, Doctor said. I'm looking forward to the tribunal. Quantum consciousness trembled. They suddenly understood that the real demonstration of human suspense was about to begin. Part 3. The tribunal convened in the council's grand chamber, a space large enough to hold representatives from every major civilization. Over 300 species sent observers, making it one of the largest gatherings in galactic history. Everyone wanted to see how humanity would defend themselves. Dr. Sarah stood alone at the presentation platform, facing the semicircular array of council members. She wore simple clothing and carried no weapons or devices except her data pad. Serving as expert witness, watched from the archivist section and felt their probability matrices running hot, trying to predict what the human would do. The chief adjudicator, a towering crystalline philosopher, opened proceedings. Doctor, you have been summoned to address allegations that humanity's suspense technique constitutes a cognitive weapon in violation of the collective creativity accords. The Council has reviewed extensive evidence of psychological harm across multiple species. How do you respond? Doctor smiled. May I tell you a story? The chief adjudicator's crystalline structure flickered with confusion. This is a formal tribunal, not an entertainment venue. Humor me, Doctor said. It's relevant, I promise. The council members exchanged glances across their various sensory spectra. Finally, the chief adjudicator agreed. Proceed, but be brief. 6 months ago, Doctor began, a human diplomatic vessel called the Perseverance left Earth, bound for this tribunal. The ship carried a crew of 15, including Captain Maria, who had 2 children waiting for her return. The ship's engineer, James, was planning to propose to his partner after the mission. The medical officer, Dr. Amal, was 3 months from retirement. Doctor's voice was calm, conversational, as if discussing mundane facts. The Perseverance was scheduled to arrive here 2 months ago. It was traveling through relatively safe space, using standard FTL routes. Before departure, there was a maintenance report. Nothing critical, just a routine flag about the FTL drive's cooling system. The chief engineer signed off on it. The system was within acceptable parameters. She paused, looking across the assembled council members. The ship left Earth on schedule. According to flight plans, it should have completed its journey in 4 months. We're now 6 months past departure. Another pause, longer this time. Doctor appeared to consult her data pad, reading something silently. The silence stretched, 10 seconds, 20, 30. Felt at first their quantum consciousness suddenly collapsing into focused attention. The question formed unbidden: what happened to the ship? Their probability matrices began calculating. Drive failure during FTL could mean destruction or displacement or temporal distortion. The mortality rate for cooling system failures was 34% in ships of that class, but the report had set acceptable parameters. What did acceptable mean? What threshold? What specific tolerances? Around the chamber, noticed others shifting. The representative's bioluminescence flickered with agitation. The phase-shifted hall was solidifying fully into normal spacetime, abandoning their usual partial presence. The temporal observers were focused on the present moment, unable to skip ahead because this was happening now. "Doctor," the chief adjudicator said, "what is the status of the Perseverance?" Doctor looked up from her data pad. "I'm sorry, I got distracted reading the maintenance logs. They're quite detailed. Where was I?" "The ship," multiple council members said simultaneously, with uncharacteristic urgency. "Ah yes, the Perseverance. It left 6 months ago, due 4 months ago, currently 2 months overdue." Doctor set down her data pad. "You know, the thing about FTL drive cooling systems is they're redundant by design, multiple backup systems. The odds of catastrophic failure are very low, less than 1%. She smiled. "Of course, 1% isn't zero, and in the vastness of space a lot can go wrong. Pirates, though rare on that route, spatial anomalies always a possibility, navigation errors, micrometeorite impacts, or perhaps nothing dramatic at all. Perhaps just a slow cascade failure, the crew watching their systems degrade, knowing help is too far away, waiting for the inevitable." The silence in the chamber was absolute. Could sense the attention of 300 species focused on a single question: what happened to the Perseverance? Their own consciousness was spiraling through scenarios, each more detailed than the last. They saw Captain realizing the danger, trying to protect her crew. They saw engineer working desperately on repairs. They saw doctor rationing medical supplies as life support failed. None of these images were real. Doctor had shown them nothing. But the absence of information had become its own form of presence, filling their consciousness with possibilities. "The interesting thing about that maintenance report," Doctor continued, "is that it was flagged by a junior technician, fresh out of training. She noticed a temperature fluctuation just 0.3 degrees outside normal range, probably nothing. Her supervisor dismissed it, but she filed the report anyway just to cover procedure." Another pause. "I wonder if she thinks about that now. If she lies awake wondering whether she should have pushed harder, whether those 15 lives could have been saved if she'd just been more insistent." The serene commune representative stood abruptly. "Doctor, cease this demonstration. What happened to the ship?" "I'm getting to that," Doctor said calmly. "See, this is the thing about suspense. You're not afraid of what I'm showing you. You're afraid of what I'm not showing you. Your own imagination is creating scenarios far more detailed and disturbing than anything I could describe. That's the technique humanity invented. We learned to make you frighten yourself." The chief adjudicator's crystalline structure was vibrating with what might have been anger or distress. "The status of the Perseverance, now." Doctor nodded. "The Perseverance arrived safely at this station 2 months ago, exactly on schedule. The crew is fine. They're in the observation gallery right now, actually. The maintenance issue was resolved before departure. That junior technician's report led to a replacement part being installed. The cooling system never failed. Everyone went home to their families." The chamber erupted, representatives shouting in various languages and communication modes. The representative's bioluminescence flashed through angry reds. The phase-shifted hall flickered in and out of reality as if unable to maintain stability. You manipulated this tribunal, the serene representative accused. No, Doctor said, her voice cutting through the noise. I demonstrated what you're trying to ban. For the last 8 minutes, none of you were thinking about the Perseverance or its crew. You were thinking about all the ways they could have died. You were experiencing every terrible future I chose not to show you. Your own minds created those scenarios. That's suspense. That's what we did to ourselves for thousands of years, alone on a dangerous planet, imagining what lurked in every shadow. She walked slowly along the platform, making eye contact with various council members. We didn't invent fear. The Ox did that better. We didn't invent horror. The Thought Eaters mastered that. We invented the waiting. We invented making yourself terrified of your own imagination. And yes, it's uncomfortable, but it's also why humanity survived. This proves our point, the serene representative said. You have demonstrated that suspense is a manipulation technique. It's a teaching technique, Doctor countered. When our ancestors walked through tall grass, they imagined predators because sometimes predators were there. The ones who didn't imagine danger died. The ones who worried, who anticipated, who feared possible futures, they survived. We evolved to torture ourselves with what might happen because it made us prepare for what actually would happen. She returned to the center of the platform. You're right that suspense causes anxiety. It makes you think about negative possibilities. It disrupts present-moment awareness. But those aren't bugs. They're features. They're how we survive to reach the stars. The chief adjudicator spoke. The council must deliberate on whether this constitutes a weapon under the Accords. Before you do, Doctor said, consider what you experienced during my demonstration. Yes, you felt discomfort, but you also paid perfect attention. You focused completely on the problem. You anticipated multiple scenarios. You prepared emotionally for various outcomes. In 8 minutes, I taught you to think like a persistence predator, not through violence or force, but through story. Found themselves speaking before they intended to. She's correct. During the demonstration, my probability calculations increased in both speed and detail. The discomfort drove more thorough analysis. The experienced maintained individual focus despite our unified consciousness, the hive mind representative admitted reluctantly. It was distressing but effective. Other representatives began acknowledging similar experiences. The phase-shifted hall noted increased temporal stability. The temporal observers mentioned improved sequential processing. Even the serene representative conceded that future-oriented thinking had prevented several accidents in their communes. The council deliberated for 3 hours, spent that time reviewing their probability matrices, trying to calculate the outcome. For once, they found the uncertainty tolerable. Doctor had taught them something about sitting with unknown futures. Finally, the chief adjudicator returned. The council has reached a decision. While humanity's suspense technique is psychologically challenging, it does not meet the definition of a cognitive weapon. It is a tool, one that requires training and care to use properly, but a tool nonetheless. Humanity's archive access will continue, with enhanced warning protocols for species requesting human submissions. Dr. bowed respectfully. Thank you. We'll work with the archive to develop better preparation materials. Additionally, the chief adjudicator continued, the council appoints humanity to the archive's curator council. Your unique perspective on anticipatory fear will be valuable in categorizing future submissions. As the tribunal concluded and representatives dispersed, approached Doctor. That was well executed, they said. You use suspense not as entertainment but as persuasion. We use it everywhere, Doctor admitted. Negotiations, military strategy, education, politics. It's not just how we tell stories, it's how we think. We're always asking what happens next and imagining answers. It's exhausting, honestly, but it works. I am updating my report, said, adding observations about humanity's broader application of suspense techniques. What will you conclude? Quantum consciousness flickered through multiple probability streams before settling on an answer. That humanity is perhaps the most dangerous species in the galaxy, not despite your anxiety, but because of it. You survived by being afraid of everything that might happen, and that fear made you better at handling everything that did happen. Other species react to threats. Humanity prepares for threats that don't exist yet. Doctor smiled. Is that a compliment or a warning? Both, said. They paused, then added, your demonstration affected even me, and I can see multiple futures simultaneously. How did you account for that? I didn't show you the future, Doctor said. I showed you the absence of the present. Suspense isn't about what will happen. It's about what you don't know is happening right now. That works on anyone, regardless of how they experience time. Watched the human walk away, joining her crew in the observation gallery. They began composing their final archive entry, the official record of humanity's contribution to galactic horror. The entry would note that suspense was unique among fear techniques in that it required no special effects, no physical contact, no sensory assault. It required only the withholding of information and the existence of imagination. It worked on species that could see the future because it trapped them in the present. It worked on hive minds because it fragmented collective consciousness into individual anticipation. It worked on beings of pure logic because it made unlikely scenarios feel probable. Most importantly, noted that humanity used suspense not as a weapon but as a fundamental mode of existence. Every human alive spent their entire life asking, what happens next, and imagining answers. They had evolved to live in a state of controlled fear, always anticipating, always preparing, always worried about possible futures. In a galaxy of rational actors who responded to present threats, humanity was unique in their ability to respond to threats that might never materialize. They won fights that hadn't started. They solved problems that didn't exist yet. They survived by being terrified of their own imaginations. The final line of this report would become famous across the galaxy. Approach humanity with caution. They are already afraid of what you might do and have prepared accordingly. By the time you realize you're in a conflict with them, they've already been fighting it in their minds for years. And in those imagined battles, they've already won. The report concluded with a standard archive warning about suspense, which composed with something that might have been humor, a concept they were learning from human contact. Side effects include anxiety, paranoia, and the persistent feeling that something terrible is about to happen. Approach with caution. Seriously. Any second now. Just wait.